Hello YouTube! I've built a F-16 Fighting Falcon from Tamiya in 1/48 scale. I also purchased a couple extra photo etch sets from Eduard for the exterior and the landing gear. And then I also bought 3 different types of resin missiles from Brassin. You can find the product numbers in the video description. The kit has excellent details with all the rivets included on the wings and the fuselage, and the design by Tamiya involved very little sanding, so you won't erase all those tiny details. I disobeyed the instructions and started with the weapons pylons and the missiles because I was excited to test out these Brassin missiles and they looked like they were fun to build. The resin missiles do have some finer details and a little bit of photo etch, so a little thinner profile, but in my mind the big advantage of them was not having to sand the 2 halves of the missile after I put it together. This was my first time using Mr. Surfacer, and I would say that I was very pleased with the results. I thinned it with lacquer thinner and used it to unify all of the surfaces, especially with the photo etch, which I didn't want to just paint straight onto. This is my new favorite paintbrush for detailing. I love the fine tip. I just wish I had it when I was painting the eyeballs on some of my 1/35 scale tank figures. I gloss coated with Mr. Hobby Super Clear before starting on the decals and the panel lining. The clear tips for the missiles that came with the Brassin set didn't fit properly, so one trick I've used before is substituting that clear part with a little bit of clear varnish. I used a few different shades of medium gray on the cockpit, lightening it up with some white to add some highlights. I sanded off the cockpit details previously so the photo etch panels would lie flat. Sometimes the pre-colored photo etch doesn't match the rest of the set, so I painted a few areas a different shade of gray to help it match a little better. Dare I say I used 50 shades of gray throughout this plane? I'll use either thick or thin CA glue, which is cyanoacrylate, maybe? Basically it's super glue, depending on how quickly I want the part to dry and become immobile. The thicker the glue, the longer you've got to adjust the fit before it completely dries out. The seat was sealed with a clear varnish prior to applying the wash. Otherwise you risk the wash soaking into the paint and becoming very difficult to remove. So I used enamel thinner to remove this particular wash. Yeah. Even with English as my first language, it is sometimes tricky. In the previous frames, I bent the seat belt so that it appears to look like wrinkled fabric instead of a hard, stiff, thin piece of metal. The pre-colored seatbelts are always too shiny and new, so I weather them with some oil paint. Typically I'll use buff or burnt umber for this. There was a lot of photo etch that went into the landing gear of this airplane, and the way the plane fits together, some of these parts must be attached towards the beginning of the build, since it's a tight and tough to reach space. So I did much of the finishing work on this area before I had even closed up the fuselage. This is a big change from a lot of the other planes that I'm used to building. Fortunately, the landing gear is very sturdy, so it's also much less riskier that you're going to break it off as you continue to build the rest of the kit. Once again, I used my new favorite Flexifile 5/0 paintbrush to paint the photo etch hydraulic lines. The photo etch on the landing gear doors gave me a chance to use my new rolling bars. I compared them to the plastic pieces to get the correct angle as I slowly rolled them into an arc, and then I glued both of the photo etch parts together after the rolling. If you do it before, you might end up cracking the glue and just having to re-glue them once they're shaped. I sanded down the tires and used the tape as guidelines. The tape isn't 100% necessary, it's just a good visual guideline that helped me get the flat edge started without moving all over the place. The photo etch on the engine nozzle was a major upgrade, and it transformed the smooth plastic surface with absolutely zero detailing into something with at least a little bit of texture. The exterior of the nozzle was an assortment of all clad colors sprayed over an X1 gloss black surface and coated with Mr. Color Super Clear. Does anyone else find it extremely satisfying to remove the strip of tape and see the clean, straight paint lines? Anyways, the next step was to add some shading with oil paints. To get a marbling effect, I use my Badger airbrush with the 0.2mm nozzle sprayed in a random pattern very close to the surface. I was constantly moving my hand, and my pointer finger on the trigger was extremely sore at the end, and I had to do this in multiple sessions. I covered the marbling with several thin coats of the same color because you must slowly build it up in multiple layers so that you don't immediately cover the base marble. I used AK Real Colors for the exterior of the plane, and I'll say that I like the quality and the durability to withstand the taping and masking that I did over them. Overall, great paint. Once again, I find it super satisfying to remove the tape and finally see my clean, fine paint line. This is the fuel port on the drop tank, and this really shows the difference of before and after the decal softener. If the decal doesn't conform to the surface, you can punch micro holes on it with either a needle or a pin vise so that softener can get underneath, and that's what I'm doing here. Here you can see the decal wrinkling after microsol was applied. I didn't touch it anymore after this, and eventually it'll straighten itself out. I primarily used a brown wash, but I mixed a little black wash directly on the aircraft, just because I felt the brown was a little too light. Here is the dreaded mold line on the canopy. I'll roughly scratch it off with a hobby knife before I go to sand it, and I'll use grits of sandpaper from 300 all the way up to 10,000. By the time you're at 10,000, you're just polishing it. The final step though was to actually use a polishing compound. I used Coarse from Tamiya and then the fine polish. The kit came with two canopies, a clear one and a smoky one, so it was good to have a backup if I messed up on the first one, and also here's a before and after. I dry brushed some of the black details on the cockpit to help them pop and make them a little more visible. This works well on the edges, which can either be worn or have sunlight reflecting off of them. Either way, dry brushing tends to add a little bit of depth to the model. I save most of my photo etch I don't use, and these were some old antennas, or maybe they're probes, I don't know, from my MIG kit that I built a little while back. My F-16 kit did not include any of these, so I was fortunate to repurpose them and added them with a little bit extra thin super glue.